The shocking secrets of Roman emperors. Why you wouldn't survive Roman rule. The problem with Suetonius on Tiberius is that you can never fully tell where the record ends and the character assassination begins. And with Tiberius specifically, this matters because he was genuinely hated by the senatorial class that produced most of the sources about him. So you read the Capri material and you have to hold two things at once. Some of this probably happened, and some of this was written by people who wanted him to look like a monster and had every professional incentive to make it stick. What's harder to dismiss is the geography. Tiberius left Rome in 26 AD and never came back. 11 years of running an empire by correspondence from an island. That's not a man who found the villa's decor relaxing. That's someone who had made a decision about what his life was going to look like and enforced it completely. The island had sections of forest designated as private groves, where young attendants dressed as Pan and woodland nymphs would wait. Romans called the place the Old Goat's Garden, a deliberate pun on Capri and the Latin word for goat. The rooms at Villa Jovis were decorated with erotic paintings and sculptures. And there was a separate library stocked with material for performers. Suetonius describes it the way you'd describe a supply closet. Reference materials for the staff. He doesn't editorialize it, he just lists it. Suetonius also describes a particular practice in the villa's pools that I'm not going to reproduce in full here, because it involves children and the sentence is one of the more disturbing things written in classical antiquity. He prefaces that section by saying what follows is almost too shameful to tell or hear. That's his warning. Written in Rome, in the 2nd century AD. The bar for what Romans considered too shameful to discuss was not low. The question I keep getting stuck on is the 11 years. Not the specific things he was doing there. The 11 years. The man ran an empire from that island without once returning to Rome. Not for the Senate, not for public ceremonies, not for anything. He had made a calculation, and the calculation was final. Caligula is harder, because the sources on him are almost uniformly written by people who had direct personal reasons to make him look as bad as possible. And he apparently made it very easy for them. Suetonius writes that Caligula would invite senators to dinner and have them file past him one by one while he looked them over at his leisure. Exactly the way a buyer inspects slaves at a market. He required senators to bring their wives to his banquets and would examine the women while their husbands stood and waited. At weddings, he would pull the groom aside and spend time with the bride. Whether this was performative or literal, Suetonius doesn't entirely settle. The accounts of what happened to the brides afterward don't resolve the ambiguity. The husbands came back to their wives and reportedly described, in clinical detail, what they had observed, because Caligula apparently required this. Suetonius includes this without flagging it as rumor. He presents it as administrative fact. What gets lost in cataloging his behavior is the response to it. The senators stood in his banquet hall and smiled. They filed past him one by one and said nothing. The men whose wives were inspected came home and gave their reports and presumably went to sleep and got up the next morning and returned to the Senate. This went on for 4 years. The conspiracy that eventually killed him in 41 AD included officers and officials who had been smiling at him in rooms like that for months or longer. Quietly planning, waiting for the timing to be right. Suetonius describes the assassination with unusual specificity. The number of wounds, the location of each, the fact that when Caligula was stabbed, he kept insisting he was still alive, and the officers continued until he wasn't. They were thorough in a way that suggests considerable prior thought had been given to making sure the job was complete. The historians who wrote about him hated him. The senators who served under him hated him. The Praetorian Guard killed him. His wife and daughter were executed immediately after. His memory was officially condemned. And yet he ruled for 4 years, because everyone around him kept performing normalcy, right up until the moment they didn't. The dinner Domitian held for the senators in 89 AD gets described in a lot of places as psychological torture, which is accurate but slightly misses what makes it interesting. The setup is well documented. The room was entirely black, floor to ceiling, every surface. Each place setting had a personalized grave marker with the guest's name carved on it. The servers were naked and painted black from head to foot. The food consisted of dishes associated with funeral offerings. Things Romans ate at mourning ceremonies, not at banquets. Domitian talked about death throughout the meal. He talked about it alone. The guests sat in silence and ate funeral food off black plates next to their own grave markers, while painted servers moved around them without speaking. Cassius Dio is the main source here. Working from earlier accounts, he wasn't present at this dinner. What he adds is the sequence of what happened after. The guests were escorted home not in their own carriages, but in Domitian's, driven by imperial servants they didn't recognize, in the dark. Dio says everyone in those carriages assumed they were going to be executed that night. They arrived home. They had barely begun to process being alive when imperial messengers appeared at their doors. Everyone braced. The messengers came in and produced the gravestones, the black dishes, the servers, now clean, now perfumed, now smiling, as gifts. A joke. The emperor's compliments. Some of those men were dead within a few years regardless. Domitian was assassinated in 96 AD. A freedman stabbed him in the groin while a servant created a distraction, and his wife had known about the plot in advance. The transition to his successor was announced so quickly that several historians have concluded the successor also knew. Which means at some point during those years, possibly during that dinner, possibly after it, the people closest to Domitian were already planning, and still showing up to his banquets and eating his funeral food, and smiling when he told his jokes. I want to be clear about the ostrich before anything else. This is not a rumor or an embellishment. Cassius Dio was sitting in the senators' section of the arena when it happened. He was a serving senator watching Commodus perform in the games, when Commodus beheaded an ostrich, walked to the senators' section carrying the severed head in his left hand and his bloodied sword in his right, and stood there holding it, looking at them, moving the head slightly. He said nothing. He just stood there with the head. What Dio writes next is one of the more remarkable passages in ancient historical writing. He writes that many of the senators would have been in danger of being killed on the spot. From laughing, not from fear. From the sheer impossibility of maintaining a straight face at what they were watching. If he had not quietly removed the laurel leaves from his ceremonial wreath and begun chewing them, and discreetly encouraged the senators near him to do the same, so that the visible movement of their jaws would disguise the fact that they were all desperately trying not to laugh at the Emperor of Rome standing in front of them holding a bird's head. Cassius Dio served as consul. He wrote an 80-volume history of Rome. He spent part of his career chewing decorative leaves in an arena, so a man with a dead ostrich wouldn't notice him laughing and have him executed. The broader performance context. Commodus had spent that day killing 100 bears from an elevated platform. He was never in any personal danger at any point, and would go on to kill giraffes, a hippopotamus, and an elephant. He fought as a gladiator and drew a salary from public funds for doing so. He had renamed Rome after himself, renamed the months after himself, and had taken to appearing in public dressed as Hercules. Dio documents all of this with the same calm register. By that point in the account, he seems to have simply accepted the situation and was writing it down accurately. Messalina is where the sources become genuinely unreliable, and it is worth being honest about that rather than just passing the stories along. Pliny the Elder records the competition story, Messalina against Rome's most celebrated prostitute, and this is almost certainly embellished, possibly wholly fabricated. The more interesting question is why Pliny considered it worth recording, rather than whether it happened. She was executed in 48 AD. The historical record about her was compiled largely after her death, by writers working in a tradition that had already decided who she was. The competition story is what you get when a historical figure has been reduced to a type, and the details are filled in accordingly. What is not disputed is the event in 48 AD itself. Claudius was outside Rome. Messalina organized a formal wedding ceremony with a man named Gaius Silius, a public ceremony, legally structured, with guests and witnesses and the full apparatus of a Roman marriage rite. This was not a secret. People attended. Silius apparently understood what he was attending and attended anyway, which is its own remarkable decision, given that Claudius was alive and would presumably return. Claudius came back. The Praetorian Guard moved quickly and foreclosed any serious discussion of pardon before it could develop. Messalina was killed the same day. The sources differ slightly on the details of her death, whether she attempted suicide or was killed outright, but agree on the speed. There was no trial in any meaningful sense. The guard had already made the decision. And then, according to Suetonius, Claudius sat down to dinner and asked why his wife was late. Suetonius records this without elaboration. He puts it there and moves on. I have read that sentence many times, and I still cannot decide if it reflects genuine confusion, some kind of protective dissociation, or something else entirely. Suetonius doesn't speculate. He just wrote it down.